This podcast is brought to you by Shift Management's Supervisory Leadership Certificate course, where online learning and live web coaching bring out the very best in frontline and middle managers. Move from operations to management thinking and develop the skills for leadership, reaching your company goals at the same time. Check out our Supervisory Leadership Certificate course on the shiftworkplace.com website today. Hello, Culture and Leadership Connections podcast listeners. I'm really excited to present to you today Alan Headbloom, who is a consultant, coach, applied linguist, and a talk show producer and host. He was born into an upwardly mobile white Christian family in the industrial American city of Detroit, and as a third-generation Swedish-Russian immigrant child, felt the early callings to explore the connection between ethnicity, language, and culture, which he has pursued for his entire life. Alan has traveled, lived, worked, and studied on 6 continents, studying a dozen languages in the process, and he is called to create belonging for newcomers and historically marginalized folks through workshops for immigrant professionals and their American counterparts who need to function across cultures and geographies, and provides one-on-one coaching to expats who need to perform at high levels in their global companies. For the past 7 years, Alan has produced a local TV show which highlights the travails and successes of immigrants to the United States, along with providing tips on American English and culture. In his community work, he co-facilitates the Institute for Healing Racism, which is an ever-rewarding, ever-humbling experience for a person born into white privilege. Welcome, Alan. I am so happy to have you on our podcast.
Thank you, Marie. It's a real joy to be with you. And working across borders and time zones is something we're all doing these days increasingly. So hello to Western Canada.
And to people around the world. We have followings in a number of different countries, surprising to me, but good. I'm glad it happens. Just a little bit of a caveat to the audience. I met Alan a number of years ago through Twitter, I believe, and I haven't been that active on Twitter, so it's kind of amazing that I've made any connections on Twitter at all, but met him and followed his work, and he does wonderful cross-cultural work, and I was very impressed with it. And so now I'm pretty excited to be able to interview him because now I can dig in a little bit deeper. Right, Alan?
Absolutely.
So why don't you tell the audience a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Well, I got the intercultural bug from my grandparents who were immigrants. And at age 12, my grandfather, who was the eldest of 13 kids to leave his native Sweden and go to the U.S. to make his way, became successful, worked hard, a typical immigrant story, and then liked to show off a bit to his brothers and sisters back home. And so every summer he would go back for a month or two and just visit relatives again. And when I was 12, he took me and my younger sister across the ocean, and I had a chance to see people doing things that weren't North American in behavior and speaking in full, joyful sentences that weren't American English. And I just thought, holy cow, this is amazing stuff. So when I got back home after a summer in Sweden, what can you do? Well, unless you live in Minnesota, maybe you can't study Swedish as a second language. So I started studying German, did that through middle school and high school, added Spanish, took French and German in college, graduate school, non-European languages. And you do a lot of traveling in the process of that. And, once you get caught up in a world that's not your first one, it makes you incredibly curious. And you start asking more and more questions and start creating friendships that are not the typical around the corner friendships that you develop in your own locale. So it's been just this ongoing blossoming journey, and you never know what's coming next, but you always know it's delightful and makes you less fearful.
I really like the less fearful piece that you just wrote, because when people only have exposure to one language, they're often afraid of hearing other languages. And that fear can really be debilitating for people. That's what's so important for people to just hear languages they don't understand around them so that they aren't fearful of them.
And I think the real advantage of putting funny sounds in your mouth as a child, I was 12 years old. I didn't care. I didn't have any self-image to protect. And so you don't mind stumbling and fumbling, and you're just trying and experimenting. And it's kind of a game. So if you get launched in that direction early enough, I think that helps ease the anxiety and just let you go and say, hey, let's embrace this. Let's try this on.
Mm-hmm. I had a similar experience when I was, I think, 8 or 9. My parents took me to Germany to meet my father's relatives. And I was amazed to hear all of these little kids that were younger than me speaking German so fluently. I went, wow. And I even remember one little incident from that where there was this 3-year-old little kid and he was trying to get his mother's attention. And I may make a mistake in this, so you'll have to correct me because your German's, I'm sure, much better than mine. He said, "Guck mal, Mutti, guck, das ist ein besoffenes Piepvogel." So basically what he said was, "Look, Mum, look, there's a drunken bird over there." It was a bird who I think was dying, but this 3-year-old, I was just amazed that he could say this whole sentence like that. And it just floored me. And I remembered it from, I was 8. I still remember it.
The magic of language in young children.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So tell me a little bit about some incidents from your childhood that you believe made you into the person you are today.
Oh, golly. I think you mentioned in the intro that I had grown up in a white family in a very white suburb of Detroit. And back then was the heyday of the U.S. auto industry. And so Oakland County, Michigan, where I grew up, was then per capita the second wealthiest county in the country. But if you don't know the blinders you grow up with, because that's just part of the water you swim in. And so it struck me in a strange way that when we went to the country clubs that my upwardly mobile parents belonged to, that all of the people seated at the linen covered tables were white and all the folks serving at the country club were Black. And it was very odd, but I didn't have the language at that early age to ask about that. But years later, when things started to make sense and history and racism and things that profoundly affect upward mobility and education and housing and opportunity, when those pieces started coming together, that helped, that childhood memory brought me into sharper focus, and I think influences a lot of my community advocacy today. For the last dozen years, I've worked with the local Chamber of Commerce and some other organizations in facilitating the Institutes for Healing Racism. And I think that racism on this continent was built by white folks, and in particular white males. The founding fathers of the US were all wealthy white landowners. And so it's incumbent upon us to now put our voices into a very awkward conversation around race and racial equity. So that's a really early memory on the cultural and equity side of my work. On the language side, I think it's just always listening to how people talk and staying curious that will just propel you in certain directions. My dad had an engineering firm and wanted his sons to go into engineering, but we both had the language bug and we both got degrees in teaching ESL. So those are two memories for me.
That's great. I think you must, as a young child, had a very strong sense of justice, because the fact that you were aware of and remember throughout your life this incident where you saw the white people sitting down and the Black people serving and thinking something's wrong with this. I don't know how to explain it, but there's something's wrong with that. To me, that points to a strong sense of justice and wanting things to be equitable, to be fair.
That's a really great way to put that. And I hadn't reflected on that in that way, but thank you for that gift in this moment, because truly anything that we do now in our family, and my daughters have sort of taken this up on their own, and especially the one living in California now, working on social justice and equity things in her work. The organizations I belong to, the people I associate with, the causes that I champion and volunteer for. Whether in my local church or donating money and time, absolutely. If there's not a sense of fairness and equity with those organizations, then I tend to shy away from those. And let me just say, I had this really interesting moment on this topic. I was a member of a monthly breakfast meeting put together by an African-American minister in the community, and he intentionally invited both men of color and white males. And Grand Rapids, Michigan, historically is very white, settled by the Dutch 150 or so years ago. And he wanted to bring white brothers and Black brothers into the same conversation. And the local economics club, they bring in famous speakers. they were noticing that the only people who attended were white folks. And so they came to our organization and said, hey, can you start attending these meetings? We'll give everyone a free 6-month membership. And I remember attending my first meeting. And even though I am very white, I was shocked to see that the room was almost 100% white in the people who were there, and grew profoundly uncomfortable with that, because this is not a reflection of U.S. population, of U.S. culture. We are roughly 40% people of color in the United States, and in another 25 years, we will be 51% people of color in the United States. And I think that sense, and so bottom line is I never joined the Econ Club just because I thought this is not representative. This is, who are you giving access to these national speakers, people talking on policy, on vision, but if folks of color aren't welcome or don't feel welcome, then the forum is totally misguided. And so anytime I look at organizations and memberships now, I think about who is invited, who is at the table.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's for me, if I walk into a room and they're all white, I immediately feel like leaving. I think, what's wrong? How did people so deliberately exclude others from this group? And it's probably unfair to think that, but it's always my first reaction. So I've also been in groups where everybody is the same race and the same culture and even from the same city. And I get that same sense of feeling uncomfortable, but not in the same way. It's more like, okay, I'm going to have to really pay attention because anything I say was probably going to be inappropriate. I have to really listen. But I know what you mean by feeling that when you're used to working in an intercultural context and seeking diversity, when you don't see it, it's almost a shock.
Yes. I think that one of the key words that we use in the Institute for Healing Racism is intentionality. Mm-hmm. And nothing ever changes unless you're intentional about things like membership and invitations. And we can all have best hopes, but without actually doing something about it, committing to something as important as inclusion.
Exactly. Yeah. We have to take some action steps and then sustain them.
Right. And I do want to give a shout out to the souls who are interested in stretching beyond their comfort zone, but just haven't very much, because it's precisely because you're comfortable in certain situations that you don't venture out into scarier venues. And whether that's a physical activity like skiing for the first time, or whether it's putting yourself into a situation where you are a racial minority for the first time in your life.
It's also that the structures of society are set up so that you don't run into people who are not like you. And particularly in the US, where neighborhoods are often segregated, people actually have to find a new place for that relationship to live. It is a shout out, because just thinking I want to do this is a great first step.
Yep. My wife teaches at the local university here, and the university is about 20 minutes outside the city in a small town that is 93% white. And we finally just moved back into the city a month ago. And our neighborhood is reflective of the national diversity. And it's funny because you don't know how oppressive it can become just swimming in this overly white sea of human beings. Then all of a sudden people around you, looked like, the United Nations in lots of ways. I remember at a stoplight, I took a picture of the car bumper sticker ahead of me that had, "I am from Ethiopia," with a flag on it. And I thought, yes, this is the world that can be. But again, you have to choose to make yourself part of that. You have to choose to stretch out and do that.
Mm-hmm. So from the groups you're born into, what would you say has most influenced your sense of culture and self now?
I think even though scads of folks look, Northern European, being Swedish-American, gave me a small sense of, there's something other than being white and Anglophone. And that is, people can speak in other languages and live extremely fruitful lives. And so that was a small peek into that world, because otherwise I'm checking all the boxes for privilege, white, male, able, hetero, Christian upbringing. So I can pass in any group and be in the dominant culture.
But that is also part of who you are. So part of it, you've been seeking to connect with people who are not like you from a young age, it appears. But you were also born into these groups and they have still influenced you. So can you think of how some of those influences might be affecting you now? They're not necessarily negative.
Right. I have just a small story to tell on myself where these identities, they were like huge cultural blinders on you. And, we all grow up in our own bubbles, but the blinders that privilege put on you, when you start to peel them back, make you just profoundly self-conscious or even embarrassed. And I remember thinking about money and the fact that, my parents paid for my college tuition every semester out of their checkbooks, right? And I had no sympathy for understanding of those friends of mine who, at lunchtime, they couldn't sit down because they were working in the college cafeteria. And, they were paying 100% of their own tuition because their parents couldn't. And I think that and other similar incidents, made me potentially really arrogant in ways that I didn't really appreciate. And it's only until you bump into other people's realities that you say, oh my gosh, how could I be so insensitive? How can I be so blind to other people's conditions? But again, if you're not living that, it's not your reality, it's not your world. And there you are, blind to it.
So when you're really sensitive to injustice, part of the work is to also learn to love your own people.
And to understand your own people, to understand your background and where you came from. Because if you don't know where you started, you're not going to be sure where you're heading and what you might want to change.
Mm-hmm. So let's go to your temperament and your personality. What would you say you're born with? And then what have you developed over time? What makes Alan Alan? People went, he was doing that when he was 2 and 6 and 25 and however old you are now.
I am 67. And I think that in the past, I've been a little bit bossy or, full of my own sense of, this is right and I'm going to do this. But mercifully, when you stick your toe in the intercultural waters, you start to recognize that there are more ways to do things and sometimes better ways of doing things. And so my best example is I was doing work with Japanese students, now some 30 years ago. And so I thought, well, geez, if I'm going to be working with Japanese, I should at least study the language, which I did for a short time, not elegantly, but enthusiastically, and then had a chance to travel to Japan and work with Japanese. And one thing that I really appreciate is this sense in Japanese culture, and just to an extent in other East Asian cultures, the sense of community over individualism. And the fact that I could be talking with one of my coaching clients who's Japanese, and before the end of the hour, they would say, oh, by the way, you may not be seeing Suzuki-san this week because his father-in-law is ill. And it struck me that they're not just considering their own lives and their own families, but their coworkers and their coworkers' lives and families and how that impacts them, and this broader awareness of identity and of the circle and of the community. And in fact, the broader community is important enough that we need to take others into consideration too, not rather, oh, well, if Suzuki's not going to make his appointment this week, he'll just call me or text me and we'll just let it go at that. But this extended communication and thoughtfulness and looking out for others. The simplest example is when you're sitting around a table with Japanese is you should never have to fill up your sake cup because other people are watching out for you and noticing, oh, your glass is getting low, and they'll reach over and pour into your cup, this mindfulness of others. And so I take that as a real gift that the more exposure we have to other ways of being allows us to say, you know what, I wasn't born with this trait, with this way of being, but I really like that. And so my metaphor is the smorgasbord or the buffet of life. You've got your plate and you can put whatever you want on the plate as you work your way through. And by golly, this isn't a North American way of being, but I really like that. I'm going to take a dollop of that as I pass by and put that on my plate.
So what are some of those dollops of culture that you've put onto your plate from all your exposure to and your keen sense of awareness of the cultural difference? What are some of those dollops that you've adopted into your own life?
Oh, golly, I think mindfulness and trying to pay more attention to the lives of others. I recognize that this is not only sort of an East Asian, or actually a lot of cultures are more other oriented than North Americans and Northern Europeans, Western Europeans. But also male-female culture. I think that in general, females pay more attention to what's going on in the lives of others. An example of that is my wife and I can be out shopping back in the days when we used to go window shopping, and it was no health risk to us to be out in public.
You mean actually be with other people on the street? Like, what is that like?
I really crave those days, and we will be back there again sometime, maybe mid 2021, but I'm so looking forward to that. But my wife would say, "Oh, look at this in this window. Wouldn't this be a great gift for our, nephew who has a birthday in 5 months?" Right? It's this not just, oh, what's interesting for me, but who in my life can I apply these moments to, these insights, these ideas, these gifts to? And so mindfulness is one thing that I try to take on intentionally, because it's not something that I feel particularly born with or grown up into.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You have explained a lot of times when you were very much aware that your cultural understandings were specific to you, right from the very beginning, almost everything that you've said. But is there anything that stands out as a particular cultural shock for you?
Of other cultures or of U.S. American culture?
You're just, whoa, I never realized that this was how I was thinking, and it's not normal. It's only specific to me and my cultural experience. That's not normal to them, right? So you've given already a lot of examples, even just going window shopping with your wife, and she's thinking 5 months ahead of a gift, and you're thinking, I never thought of that before. Right? Or what you explained about being in Japan and saying Suzuki-san would not be there because of the collective responsibilities that he has, and realizing that your approach is individual first and collective second. And that's a cultural shock experience right there. Can you think of anything else that stands out?
Another example from my younger days. So I lived and studied and worked in southwestern Germany for a year. And the last 5 months I had lived with a family, actually a woman who emigrated to Canada now as a Canadian citizen, was a friend of mine. And she said, "Hey, after you're done studying in the university town, just go up the road a couple of hours and you can stay with my family." And found me a job. And I was living with them and loving this experience in my very early 20s. And as I felt, this closeness, both, I think, culturally, linguistically, personally with this family, I made the mistaken move with my host mother. I told her, I said, I just feel so close to the family. I would like you to start calling me du instead of sie. And it's the same in French with vous and tu, and Spanish usted and tú. And so I just said, please call me du from now on. And she said, "Oh, Alan," she said, "one hasn't," and it's the German man kennt sich nicht so gut noch nicht.
And we don't know each other yet well enough for that.
and my goodness, I've been living and sleeping at your house and laughing and washing dishes for 5 months. And that wasn't long enough. And here in North American society, and I know that especially because of U.S. American history, of always, moving west from the East Coast and having to make friends or get to know people very quickly, it makes us, open up much more quickly. And that's, and sometimes it's looked down upon by other cultures that Americans are just very shallow, because they'll greet you with a big smile and chat with you, and then they'll never call you again. And so are seen as superficial, but I think it's also a coping mechanism, historically speaking. Mm-hmm. And so for me, just being friendly and what I thought was warmth and what qualified as being of the do status. And in fact, I said, "Oh, no, you don't have to. I will still call you Sie, Frau Bayer, but you please." And no, it's this deflection. I was initially so hurt. But again, here's this awareness of that. No, there are cultural rules. And I think things have eased up now with du and sie in Germany over, multiple decades. Golly, dare I say 5 decades now, or almost 5, going on 5 decades from my experience. But those are the rules of the road, Buster, and you got to get used to them. So your definition of closeness and others is not the same.
Mm-hmm.
So there's another example in a much different light.
That's a great story. I almost think that we need to accept that belonging is an illusion. It's never going to be belonging on our own terms. It's going to be how much other people let us in. And maybe the work is really just to make them feel comfortable rather than worrying about us being accepted by them.
So are you a lifelong Edmontoner? And is that the demonym for people from Edmonton?
Well, I grew up in the prairies in this area, yes, but I have, like you, lived and worked in different countries and continents. But
so what created belonging for you, or have you only felt belonging in Alberta?
I never feel like I belong.
Why do you think that is?
That's another story. You can interview me on your show.
Very good. It sounds like a date.
Yeah, but I think that really, for me, it has become really a mission to help others feel included, to bring those that have been excluded into the circle of intimate friends, rather than to expect that I will be included.
Typically on our show, I'll wrap up with the question, what is belonging to you, to these guests who are overwhelmingly immigrant, refugee, expat folks? And the answers really vary about what's belonging for you. And some of it is, welcoming. And it's sort of that, if you watch the sitcom Cheers from decades ago, the theme song is, you want to be where everyone knows your name, where they're always glad you came. And so is it that, what creates welcome for you? And other people have answered, no, it's not others' responsibility. It's my own responsibility for making myself comfortable and welcome. So I heard, many different answers. So
I wanted to ask you, before we wrap things up today, what would you like to promote? Here's your chance to get on the soapbox and say, this really matters to me. I want people to know about it. What would you like to tell the audience about?
My soapbox, I think I have the most credibility standing up and talking in front of other white folks and native speakers. And that is, first of all, give outsiders a chance. They're not trying to take your job. They're not trying to steal your culture. They're trying to make their lives better the way that your great or great grandparents did when they settled in North America. And so to the extent that you would like an opportunity, just a fair shot, give that opportunity to these people who don't dress like you and eat funny food and don't talk like you. Give them a chance, because that's all anybody really wants. Everyone is really glad to work hard because they know that there are opportunities and lots of systems in place in North America that allow for people to succeed, but they need to be given that shot. So that's maybe the biggest message that I would soapbox about.
That's a great message. Anything else you'd like to say?
To my white brothers and sisters, don't be afraid to put yourself in awkward positions where you are not the majority. And that could be by gender, it could be by first language, it could be by race or ethnicity. And just try to get a sense for what that is like so that you can start to unlearn senses of privilege and entitlement. Because once we become aware of what others are going through and the lenses that they see the world through, I think it makes you a more tolerant and hopefully ultimately a more loving, accepting person.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps helps to see their strengths and resources and the areas in which they would have the privilege to let you into as well.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been lovely, and I would like to ask you a lot more questions, but I think we're at the end of the interview. So thank you so much, Alan, for joining me and for providing this insightful moment for our Culture and Leadership Connections podcast listeners.
It's been a real delight, Maria. I really appreciate talking with you, and I look forward to keeping up the conversation offline.
Alan Headbloom has been an ally for marginalized peoples and groups his whole life. As an intercultural communications specialist, He works to create bridges of understanding and then accompanies others to cross that bridge by introducing them to each other's worlds. I thoroughly enjoyed my interview with Alan Headbloom and hope you will check out his website and his podcast called Alan on the Air. His business offers both global and domestic intercultural services, including consulting and coaching for non-native speakers of English and racial equity, respect in the workplace, unconscious bias, and microaggressions in the workplace. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. You can follow the podcast on followthepodcast.com/culture and leadership. You can also rate the podcast on lovethepodcast.com/culture and leadership. Use the and sign when you do that. Or you can go to our Patreon site to contribute to the podcast and benefit from member perks. Thank you for listening. And may culture and leadership connections continue to guide and inspire your day. This podcast would not be possible without the expertise of our Culture and Leadership Connections production team. A big thank you and shout out to Mike Kurlander for audio production and editing, to Malvika Kathpal for the show notes, Bernadette Guadiz for online web and social media management and promotions, Celine Bayogo for design, and Kirsten Hoyer for website and branding. Thank you so much. Hey, Culture and Leadership Connections podcast listeners, I have 3 great ways you can show your love for a fabulous podcast. Number 1, followthepodcast.com/culture and leadership. This link lets you follow our podcast instantly on any directory you choose. Number 2, lovethepodcast.com/culture and leadership. This link lets you rate and review the podcast with 2 clicks. Number 3, patreon.com/culture and leadership connections. This is a link for serious fans who want to get in on some bonus content. We have cross-cutting themes, a monthly discussion on Discord, extra podcast, guest video interviews, and inside scoop videos with team members. I know you'll love it. And you can help us continue to create our stellar shows with a tiny monthly subscription at the same time. So if you aren't following, go to followthepodcast.com/culture and leadership. If you're already following, go to lovethepodcast.com/culture and leadership. And if you've already rated and you're still following, and you still love it, and you're a big fan, go to patreon.com/culture and leadership connections. Thank you in advance for being a fan and for helping support creative, honest, and authentic podcast productions.